Okay, so one of the other things that I want to elaborate on a little bit from the YouTube videos has to do with the criticisms to Piaget's theory. So one of the major criticisms is that Piaget underestimated the rate at which kids are actually developing some of these abilities, right? And to illustrate that, or to illustrate a study that supports that criticism, I'm going to show you a video of a study that seems to produce some results that are contradictory to Piaget. And I should say there are other studies that also seem to support this idea that Piaget underestimated the cognitive abilities of kids. This is just one, I think, really good example study. So I'm going to show it to you, but I'm also going to ask you some questions about it to make sure you're paying attention, especially to the methods of the study. I'm going to ask you to identify for me the variables, the results, etc. Okay. So let me share my screen here.
At the University of Illinois, a team of researchers is now using ingenious experiments to discover previously unsuspected abilities of newborns and young children.
3 months, 22 days.
Professor René Baillargeon studies how babies develop the concept of object permanence.
By object permanence, we mean really a set of beliefs about objects. The first and most fundamental belief is that objects continue to exist when hidden. The first person to investigate the development of object permanence beliefs in infants was Jean Piaget, the famous Swiss psychologist. And he claimed that it's not until approximately 8 to 9 months of age that infants understand that objects continue to exist when hidden, and that it's not until approximately 12 months of age that babies begin to understand that objects not only exist but retain their physical and spatial properties when hidden. What we've done is to devise a series of tasks where the infant simply had to look at possible and impossible events.
In this experiment, a 6-month-old baby watches a cart rolling down tracks, going behind a screen and coming out the other side. The screen is lifted to show a block sitting behind the tracks. Next, the baby sees the block placed on top of the tracks. The screen comes down, the cart rolls exactly as before. But in the real world of permanent objects, the block should have stopped the cart. The baby stares longer at this apparently impossible event.
Okay, so I'm going to pause here and ask you to identify for me, first, what is the independent variable in the study? There's something that is being varied, right? What's the independent variable? And then, what you think about that, I also want you to identify for me the dependent variable. What is being measured? This is an experimental study, so remember, in any experimental study, we manipulate something, and then we measure our hypothesized effect. So what's the independent variable? What did we manipulate? What's the dependent variable? What did we expect would be affected by the independent variable?
When infants are surprised or puzzled by an event, they tend to look at it longer. So our prediction is always that if infants perceive the events as we do, then they will look longer at the impossible or magical event than at the possible event. And what we found is that infants as young as 3.5 months of age, and perhaps younger, but certainly as young as 3.5 months of age, understand that objects continue to exist when hidden. One contribution of this research is to say that we must really take a very close look at infants' physical knowledge. It's much richer, much more sophisticated than used to be thought.
Okay, so that's the first major criticism to Piaget that I want you to be familiar with. The second one, and this was also discussed in the YouTube video, comes from, well, it's most famously associated with a psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, who argued that Piaget's theory is much too individualistic. So if you remember back when I was talking about assimilation and accommodation, I said that for Piaget, the child's development is basically just driven by the individual child interacting with the physical world, right? So picking up apples or peppers or whatever it might be. And what Vygotsky said is that's certainly one way in which kids develop, but you're forgetting that kids, humans more broadly, are an inherently social species, right? which means that we're also developing, and our development is driven by our interactions with other people. In particular, Vygotsky spent a lot of time thinking about things like teaching and things like language, where older adults, right, are actually trying to guide the development of kids. And Vygotsky spent a lot of time on this theory and also produced a lot of evidence that suggests that there is an important social component to cognitive development as well. But one piece of evidence that I just want you to know, if you look at studies that look at a couple of things, but most importantly, how much parents read to their kids and how much parents just speak with their kids, you find that the more parents do that, the quicker kids develop theory of mind, that ability that we talked about earlier. And that seems to provide at least some support for Vygotsky's idea that development isn't just happening in a vacuum, right, where there's an individual person interacting with objects in the world, but there's also a social component. Social inputs matter too. And if parents give more of those social inputs, they do more directed teaching, they do more reading to the kids, they do more talking to the kids and asking them questions about things, kids develop quicker than the kids of parents who don't do a lot of that extra sort of social scaffolding and don't give a lot of those social inputs. Okay, so that's some data that supports Vygotsky's idea too, that development is at least partly social. Now, none of this is to say that Piaget is entirely wrong. That's not true. We have a lot of research that suggests that a lot of what Piaget was saying is correct. A lot of it's been upheld by studies, but we also know that Piaget was probably incomplete. He's incomplete in at least two senses. One is that he underestimated at least some of the cognitive abilities of kids. And the other is that he underestimated the influence of social forces, which we know are really important for cognitive development as well. All right, thanks.